The Air Navigation and Transport Act is an Act of Parliament of the United Kingdom Parliament in 1920 which gave the British Empire the authority to control air navigation in the Commonwealth countries and territories. It also put into effect the International Commission for Air Navigation. History of the Act. The first attempts at international regulation of air navigation were made in 1910 in Paris, when representatives of 19 European countries attended an international air conference. The meeting was abandoned when agreement on the contents could not be reached. At a peace conference after World War I, the regulation of air navigation was once again discussed. Because of the advances made in aviation during the war, all attending members agreed to hold an international conference to draw up rules and international regulations for air traffic. On the 25th of February 1919, an Air Traffic Committee of 36 states in the British Empire under the Council of Defence met for the first time. The Paris Convention was signed on the 13th of October 1919 by all attending representatives of the Commonwealth states. Major General Legge, chairman of the committee, noted that there should be only one regulatory air authority for Australia, working under a single legislature. At a Premier's conference in May 1920, the Australian Prime Minister W. M. Hughes's recommendation that each state should refer to the Commonwealth the control of air navigation, but in a way as to reserve to the states the right to own and use aircraft for the purpose of government departments and the police powers of the state, was carried, and the Commonwealth passed the Air Navigation Act in the widest possible terms. The Air Navigation Act of 1920 was granted assent on the 2nd of December 1920, gazetted on the 11th of February 1921, came into force on the 28th of March 1921 and became law on the 28th of June 1921. Regulations under the Act provided for the registration of aircraft, licensing of aerodromes, licensing of personnel, periodic inspection and maintenance of aircraft, and rules of the air. The Act in use. Britain. The Aviation Security Act 1982 is an Act of Parliament of the United Kingdom Parliament which covers offences against the safety of aircraft, protection of aircraft, aerodromes, and air navigation installations, against acts of violence, policing of airports, and funding. In addition to murder and conspiracy, the defendants at the Pan Am Flight 103 bombing trial were accused of breaches of the 1982 Act. List of acts and adaptations. Australia Air Navigation Act 1920. Air Navigation Act 1936. Air Navigation Act 1947. Ratification of the Convention on International Civil Aviation. Air Navigation Act 1947. Statute Law Revision Act 1950. Air Navigation Act 1960. Act No. 72 of 1961. Air Navigation Act 1961. Act No. 8 of 1963. Air Navigation Act 1963. Act No. 93 of 1966. Statute Law Revision Act 1966. Act No. 79 of 1971. Air Navigation Act 1971. Act No. 130 of 1973. Air Navigation Act 1973. Act No. 216 of 1973. Statute Law Revision Act 1973. Act No. 216 of 1973. Air Navigation Act 1920. Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 11 of 1991. Air Navigation Act 1920. Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 82 of 1992. Air Navigation Act 1920. Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 5 of 1994 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 64 of 1994 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 168 of 1994 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 82 of 1995 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 95 of 1995 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 174 of 1995 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 30 of 1997 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 95 of 1998 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 156 of 1999 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 48 of 2000 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 55 of 2001 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 143 of 2001 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 8 of 2002 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 63 of 2002 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 143 of 2002 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 19 of 2003 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 83 of 2003 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 140 of 2003 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 9 of 2004 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 64 of 2004 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 149 of 2004 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 109 of 2006 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 21 of 2007 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Act No. 87 of 2008 Air Navigation Act 1920 Act No. 50 of 1920 as amended. Air Navigation Act 1920 as amended to 5 March 2016. Britain Act 27 of 1917 Air Force Act. Act 50 of 1920 Air Navigation Act. Act 11 of 1930 Air Transport Act. Act 153 of 1936 Air Navigation Act. Act 62 of 1937 Air Aid Precautions Act. Act 6 of 1938 Air Navigation Act. Act 3 of 1939 Air Ministry Act. Act 7 of 1947 Air Navigation Act. Act 3 of 1949 Airways Corporations Act. Act 64 of 1949 Air Corporations Act. Act 2 of 1950 Air Force Reserve Act. Act 5 of 1953 Air Corporations Act. Act 399 of 1955 Air Force Act. Act 35 of 1956 Air Corporations Act. Act 3 of 1960 Air Corporations Act. Act 4 of 1960 Air Transport Licensing Act. Act 13 of 1962 Air Corporations Act. Act 2 of 1965 Airports Authorities Act. Act 83 of 1965 Airports Authority Act. Act 20 of 1966 Air Corporations Act. Act 35 of 1967 Air Corporations Act. Act 4 of 1969 Air Corporations Act. Act 2 of 1971 Aviation Act. Act 4 of 1971 Airport Authority Act. Act 33 of 1975 Air Travel Reserve Fund Act. Act 78 of 1975 Airports Authority Act. Act 273 of 1977 Aircraft and Shipbuilding Industries Act. Act 2 of 1982 Airport Security Act. Act 126 of 1982 Aviation Security Act. Act 6 of 1986 Airport Act. Act 203 of 1986 Airports Act. Act 56 of 1990 Aviation and Maritime Security Act. Act 2 of 2003 Aviation Act. Ireland 5 1928 Air Navigation Act 1920 Adaptation Order 1928 21 1928 The Air Navigation Regulations 1928 68 1928 Air Navigation Regulations 1928 34 1929 Air Navigation Regulations 1929 26 1930 Air Navigation Regulations 1930 53 1932 Air Navigation Regulations 1932 245 1934 Air Navigation Regulations 1934 361 934 Air Navigation Order 1934 361 1934 Air Navigation Regulations 1934 561 935 Air Navigation Order 1935 Air Navigation and Transport Act 1936 108 1938 Air Navigation Regulations 1938 263 1938 Air Navigation Directions 1938 53 1939 Air Navigation Regulations 1939 47 1940 Air Navigation Regulations 1940 Air Navigation and Transport Act 1942 288 1943 Air Navigation Regulations 1928 Regulations 1943 347 1943 Air Navigation Regulations 1943 376 1946 Air Navigation and Transport Act 1936 Order 1946 Air Navigation and Transport Act, 1946. 1947. Air Navigation and Transport Act, 1936. Regulations, 1947. 113. 1947. Air Navigation Order, 1947. 116. 1947. Customs-Free Airport Regulations, 1947. 132. 1947. Air Navigation Directions, 1947. 433. 1947. Air Navigation and Transport Order, 1947. 96. 1949. Air Navigation Order, 1949. Air Navigation and Transport Act, 1950. 31. 1951. Air Navigation Order, 1951. 33. 1951. Air Navigation Order, 1951. 65. 1951. Air Navigation Order, 1951. 403. 1951. Air Navigation and Transport Order, 1951. 74. 1952. Air Navigation Order, 1952. 96. 1953. Air Navigation Order, 1953. 228. 1953. Air Navigation and Transport Act, 1936. Regulations, 1953. 353. 1953. Air Navigation Order, 1953. 118. 1954. Air Navigation Order, 1953. Order, 1954. 110. 1956. Air Navigation and Transport Act, 1936. Order, 1956. 19. 1957. Air Navigation Regulations, 1957. Air Navigation and Transport Act, 1959. Air Navigation and Transport Act, 1959. Air Navigation and Transport Act, 1961. 187. 1962. Air Navigation Regulations, 1930. Order, 1962. 7. 1963. Air Navigation Order, 1963. No. 65. 1963. Air Navigation Order, 1963. 87. 1963. Air Navigation and Transport Order, 1963. 88. 1963. Air Navigation Order, 1963. 120. 1963. Air Navigation and Transport Order, 1963. Order, 1963. 148. 1963. Air Navigation and Transport Act, 1959. Order, 1963. Air Navigation Act, 1963. 141. 1964. Air Navigation Order, 1964. 141. 1964. Air Navigation Order, 1964. 264. 1964. Air Navigation and Transport Act, 1936. Order, 1964. 291. 1964. Air Navigation Act, 1963. Order, 1964. Air Navigation and Transport Act, 1965. 94 1966, Air Navigation and Transport Act 1965, Order 1966, 96 1966, Air Navigation and Transport Act 1965, Regulations 1966, 165 1966, Air Navigation Order 1966, 273 1966, Air Navigation Order 1966, 272 1967, Air Navigation Order 1967, 26 1968, Air Navigation Order 1968, 134 1968, Air Navigation Order 1968, 147 1969, Air Navigation Order 1969, 291 1970, Air Navigation Order 1970, 291 1971, Air Navigation Regulations 1971, Air Navigation Act 1971, 59 1972, Air Navigation Regulations 1972, 161 1972, Air Navigation Regulations 1972, 281 1972, Air Navigation Order 1972, 22 1973, Air Navigation Order 1973, 102 1973, Air Navigation Order 1973, 187 1973, Air Navigation Order 1973, 214 1973, Air Navigation Regulations 1973, 224 1973, Air Navigation Order 1973, 291 1973, Air Navigation Regulations 1973, 327 1973, Air Navigation Regulations 1973, 343 1973, Air Navigation and Transport Act 1973, Order 1973, Air Navigation and Transport Act 1973, 18 1974, Air Navigation Order 1974, 7 1975, Air Navigation Order 1975, 249 1975, Air Navigation Regulations 1975, Air Navigation and Transport Act 1975, Air Navigation and Transport Act 1975, 61 976, Air Navigation Order 1976, 251 976, Air Navigation Order 1976, 83 1977, Air Navigation Regulations 1977, 35 1978, Air Navigation Regulations 1978, 76 1979, Air Navigation Regulations 1979, 194 1979, Air Navigation Order 1979, 335 1979, Air Navigation Order 1979, 78 1980th Air Navigation Regulations 1980, 307 1980th Air Navigation Order 1980, 104 1981st Air Navigation Regulations 1981, 343 1981st Air Navigation Regulations 1981, 349 1981st Air Navigation Order 1981, 71,982nd Air Navigation Regulations 1982, 307 1982nd Air Navigation Regulations 1982, 47 1983rd Air Navigation Order 1983, 82 1983rd Air Navigation Regulations 1983, 418 1983rd Air Navigation Regulations 1983, Air Navigation Act 1983, 13 1984th Air Navigation Order 1984, 15 1984th Air Navigation Order 1984, 106 1984th Air Navigation Order 1984, 2 1985th District Court Acts 1963 to 1983 Rules 1984, 243 1985th Air Navigation Order 1985, 261 1985th Air Navigation Order 1985, 434 1985th Air Navigation Order 1985, 435 1985th Air Navigation Regulations 1985, 436 1985th Air Navigation Act 1983 Order 1985, 62 1986 Air Navigation Order 1986, 229 1986 Air Navigation and Transport Act 1986 Order 1986, Air Navigation and Transport Act 1986, 56 1988 Air Navigation and Transport Act 1986 Order 1988, 284 1988 Air Navigation Order 1988, 342 1988 Air Navigation Order 1988, Air Navigation and Transport Act 1988, 114 1989 Air Navigation Order 1989, 131 1989 Air Navigation Order 1989, 165 1989 Air Navigation and Transport Order 1989, 322 1989 Air Navigation Order 1989, 346 1989 Air Navigation Order 1989, 362 1989 Air Navigation Regulations 1989, 12 1990th Air Navigation Order 1990, 116 1990th Air Navigation and Transport Regulations 1990, 312 1990th Air Navigation Regulations 1990, 321 1990th Air Navigation Order 1990, 52 1990 seconds, Air Navigation Order 1992, 205 1990 thirds, Air Navigation Order 1993, 323 1990 thirds, Air Navigation and Transport Act 1965 Regulations 1993, 324 1990 thirds, Air Navigation and Transport Act 1965 Regulations 1993, 325 1990 thirds, Air Navigation Order 1993, 74 1990 fifths, Air Navigation Order 1995, 171 1990 fifths, Air Navigation Order 1995, 222 1990 fifths, Air Navigation Order 1995, 49 1996 Air Navigation Order 1996, 51 996 Air Navigation Order 1996, 321 1996 Air Navigation Order 1996, 101 1997 Air Navigation Order 1997, 198 1997 Air Navigation and Transport Order 1997, 205 1997 Air Navigation Regulations 1997, 206 1997 Air Navigation and Transport Order 1997, 221 997 The Air Navigation Order 1997, Air Navigation and Transport Act 1998, 326 1998 Air Navigation and Transport Act 1998 Order 1998, 327 1998 Air Navigation and Transport Act 1998 Order 1998, 21 1999 Air Navigation Order 1999, 159 1999 Air Navigation Order 1999, 423 1999 Irish Aviation Authority Order 1999, 287 2000 Air Navigation and Transport Act 1998 Order 2000, 375 2000 Air Navigation and Transport Act 1998 Order 2000, 627 2001 Air Navigation and Transport Order 2001, Air Navigation and Transport Act 2001, 102 2002 Air Navigation and Transport Order 2002, 162 2002 Air Navigation and Transport Order 2002, 266 2002 Air Navigation and Transport Order 2002, 319 2002 Air Navigation and Transport Order 2002, 458 2002 Air Navigation and Transport Order 2002, 246 2003 Air Navigation and Transport Act 1998 Order 2003, 645 2003 European Communities Regulations 2003, Air Navigation and Transport Act 2004, Air Navigation and Transport Act 2005, 161 2007 Air Navigation and Transport Act 1998 Order 2007, 462,009 Air Navigation Regulations 2009, 392,010 Air Navigation and Transport Act 2004 Order 2010, 515,014 Air Navigation and Transport Act 1998 Order 2014, Singapore Act 11 of 1966 Air Navigation Act 1966, 1970 Revised Edition Air Navigation Act, Act 12 of 1971, Tokyo Convention Act 1971, 1985 Revised Edition Air Navigation Act, Act 164 of 1985, Air Navigation Order 1985, Act 32 of 1986, Statutes Act 1986, Act 406 of 1988, Act 44 of 1989, Act 73 of 1989, Act 476 of 1989, Act 239 of 1990, Act 436 of 1990, 1990 Revised Edition Air Navigation Order, Act 573 of 1991, Act 49 of 1992, Act 60 of 1992, Act 180 of 1992, Act 61 of 1993, Act 199 of 1993, Act 8 of 1994, Act 7 of 1997, Statutes Act 1997, Act 67 of 1998, Air Navigation Order 1998, Act 28 of 2000, Statutes Act 2000, Act 325 of 2000, Air Navigation Order 2000, Act 384 of 2000, Air Navigation Order 2000, Act 166 of 2002, Air Navigation Order 2002, Act 4 of 2003, Customs Act 2003, Act 56 of 2003, Air Navigation Order 2003, Act 440 of 2003, Air Navigation Order 2003, Act 581 of 2003, Air Navigation Order 2003, Act 331 of 2005, Air Navigation Order 2005, Act 781 of 2005, Air Navigation Order 2005, Act 487 of 2006, Air Navigation Order 2006, Act 640 of 2006, Air Navigation Order 2006, Act 12 of 2007, Air Navigation Act 2007, Act 17 of 2009, Civil Aviation Authority of Singapore Act 2009, Act 299 of 2009, Air Navigation Order 2009, Act 278 of 2010, Air Navigation Order 2010, Act 423 of 2010, Air Navigation Order 2010, Act 729 of 2010, Air Navigation Order 2010, Act 162 of 2011, Air Navigation Order 2011, Act 570 of 2011, Air Navigation Order 2011, Act 124 of 2012, Air Navigation Order 2012, Act 617 of 2012, Air Navigation Order 2012, Act 348 of 2013, Air Navigation Order 2013, Act 10 of 2014, Air Navigation Act 2014, 2014 Revised Edition, Air Navigation Act.